Welcome, everyone. I hope this finds you well. I just ask that if if you think there's noise in the background or conversation where you are in the background, that you just put yourselves on mute so that it won't interrupt the flow. But I'm happy to have you not on mute otherwise. And I'm going to certainly welcome opportunities for engagement and conversation. I'm glad that you could all be with me. For those who don't know me, I'm Bill Plevan. It's nice to see. I know some of you. I definitely know that some of you have been on some of the sessions I've done for Anshe Chesed, and in the past, in live and in person. And it's really lovely to have all of you with me. Let's see.
Okay, the Eclipse of God.
Okay.
Rabbi,
You're on now.
Oh.
You're on.
I'm gonna mute us.
Okay. Goodbye and enjoy.
Okay. I want to introduce some thoughts and reflections on faith in difficult times from Martin Buber. As many of you know, Martin Buber has been a long time research interest of mine. I wrote my doctoral dissertation on Buber. I'm working on a book on his writings now. And I'm framing this particularly in the run-up to Tisha B'Av, but I think that the reflections here are more expansive than that. And I would say that, in a sense, Tisha B'Av, as we know, is a kind of holding place for a lot of events in Jewish history, and I would say in a kind of a general way, really confrontation with communal and social suffering, or sort of suffering, not just on the individual level, but at the social and political level as well. And so I think that what I want to explore here is, what is it that we mean by having difficulty with faith in the face of not just our own personal forms of suffering and crisis, but when we experience that crisis on a social and political level, as well as a community and as a society. And Buber has this very important and valuable metaphor that he develops in several places in his writing, called the eclipse of God. As I'll point to, I think that the phrase "eclipse of God" is a reference to a phrase in the book of Deuteronomy. Actually, it appears twice in the book of Deuteronomy, and there are a few other places in the Bible that have a resonance with this theme. But what I want to do first is I want to pose two questions to all of you, and I'd welcome sharing responses to these questions either verbally or through the chat. If you know how to use the chat feature, feel free to go ahead and use that. I don't think there's anything in the chat yet. I'm going to put up the chat here. Okay. I've shared, so you can see I'm sharing the screen right now. I've also shared a link to the text itself on Dropbox. So if you want to just have it for yourself or print it out, you can do that as well. The first question I want to ask is, what does it mean for you to say that you have faith in God, with a particular emphasis on the word faith? Like, what does it mean to say that there's faith in God? And again, if you want to just share that, what does it mean to have faith in God? Either, again, sharing on the chat or sharing verbally, and feel free to just, maybe raise a hand or jump in. I think I'll be able to navigate the different voices.
You come closer so you can read this. Where did he go?
Someone want to jump in? Just with a thought about what it means to have faith? is that Judy? If you're trying to speak, you're on mute. So
Thought there. I'm holding down the thing. Yeah, that to believe that God exists.
And it requires something of us.
who is that?
That was Alan.
That was
Oh,
Alan, who's not on
Got
picture
it.
right now because
I
this is
couldn't tell that was
typical
coming.
with me.
Yes, hi, Alan. So I couldn't
There
tell.
we
Right, I couldn't tell it was coming from the same,
Yeah.
computer source.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
But isn't there a difference between belief and faith? Like, I would make that different. You can believe in God, but having faith means I'm having a hard time kind of actually coming up with the definition. But I feel like there's a difference between a belief and having faith. And like, if you have faith in someone, you try to trust them. If you believe in God, that you're just stating, I believe there is a God. But faith is a step further, and there's like a trust aspect of it.
Yeah. Okay. That's great, and that sort of anticipates something that Buber's gonna say, and yeah. So we might make this distinction between, and I would say, by the way, I'm not sure that all theologians and religious thinkers take pains to make that distinction, and they may conflate the two. But I think it's certainly it's a plausible distinction, right? To say that there's belief that I'm going to say is something more cognitive, right? A belief that in a fact or something like that, right? And faith as a kind of trust, right? Which has more akin to a relationship with a person.
God or belief.
Right. And again, that's actually a distinction Buber's going to want to make, and not every religious thinker does, right? Or maybe some religious thinkers emphasize one or the other, yeah. Anyone else? Yeah. I think someone.
I'm muted. It's Marcia.
Yeah, go ahead, Marcia. Hi, Marcia.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi. I just think that when you talk about belief, it's sort of pointing to the person, and faith, you're somewhat expecting something to an object, to God, to something else. It's not just within the person. It's inclusive of God or of a being.
So if I understand that, does it make sense to say, to describe what you're saying, that belief might be my subjective condition of, like, I have a belief, as opposed to faith, where there's a sense of confidence that something's actually coming from the other side?
You're kind of expecting something else to you. It's
Right.
sort of a two-way street.
Right. And I think that might be related to what Roberta said about trust, right?
Yeah.
That there's there's a confidence, right? So sometimes, and actually, this is in Hebrew too. There's sometimes the word in some I think in some Hasidic literature, right, that the word bitachon, right, which has the sense of security or confidence, gets used, right? That faith is a kind of confidence, right? I'm confident that something's going to happen, or I'm confident in something, right? So there's that kind of association, but that can be a form of trust as well, and not necessarily a kind of cognitive belief. Anyone else want to chime in or use the chat to share a thought about it?
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Now. No. Are
I
you
agree,
playing with this?
Marcia.
I keep changing it.
Marcia, I hear you. So is there something else you wanted to share? Or?
Fred is here.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, what I was going to say is faith tends to be a concept that is broader than just one person. It's more of an inclusive thing that relates to involvement with a group, a connection to some broader organized thing
Right.
or idea.
Okay. Yeah, and that's a good point, right? So sometimes there's some religious traditions that maybe talk about faith in a very personal sort of way, but there's also a sense in which we use the word faith to refer to a communal or social structure or a communal being part of a certain kind of tradition of faith, right? A way of thinking about God or a relationship to God that's shared communally, right? And so people speak of, your faith as not just a personal thing, but something that you participate in with a group, right? Yeah. Yeah, that's helpful too. And we might want to think about different ways, though, in which we think about that at a communal level, right? How does faith work at the communal level? Again, especially with Tisha B'Av as a holiday where faith is challenged, it's a communal relationship with God that's under consideration, that's being challenged, I think, and not just an individual experience of God. Right? The other question I want to pose is very briefly is whether any of you have ever felt challenged or ambivalent about the word God. Does the word God itself have a kind of either a negative connotation or just a challenging connotation when you use it or when you hear other people use it, which is just as important here, right? Is there something about the word God that has been a struggle for you about either, again, when someone else uses it or you use it, or you not using it is a struggle, right? And again, feel free to use the chat, but and feel free to chime in or just jump in here. Make sure you're unmuted. Everyone's really good with using the word God, right?
No, no. I find it a very troubling concept.
Okay. How so?
Well, first of all, because it's very difficult for me to believe in God, except in a very metaphorical sense.
Mm-hmm.
And secondly, because if other people use it, it's as if they're attributing some sort of authority to whatever they are saying God does, a sense of authority that I might not share.
Right. So you have one challenge is the challenge of what Naomi is describing as belief, difficulty in believing in God, except maybe in a metaphorical sense. And then there's the way in which the name of God is invoked by others, especially when it seems to be an invocation of authority, and if I may add, maybe power, right? Anyone else want to chime in?
Well, it's also a word that people use just as an expression. So that's a little distressing. You don't know whether people like God only knows or, from your mouth to God's ears, but no one really believes that it's going up to, it's not that, or, thank God, but do we really think that they're talking about this spirit or this holy person, or it's just like, it's now become vernacular and people use it. So it's a hard word because it's on two levels.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, in some ways, I think of that as the counterpart to what Naomi brought up was like that the word God becomes too significant when it's invoked as a form of authority, but then then it's used so casually at the same time to the point where it kills its significance, right? In other words, if it's used casually, what are you really talking about? What do you really mean? Is that meant seriously, right?
As an example, Einstein is often quoted as saying God does not play dice with the universe. And a lot of people say that means Einstein believed in God, I tend to think that just means he doesn't feel very comfortable with probability and statistics. But take what you want from it.
Right, right. I'm totally an expert on Einstein, but he definitely didn't believe in the kind of what I'll call the classic vision of a biblical God, right? That's not his God anyway, for sure. But that's an interesting example of where God then is invoked, right? There's a certain cultural resonance of the word that he feels he can invoke to make a point about what he thinks the world is like. And he thinks it'll sort of resonate by saying that, right? As opposed to saying like nothing in the world is left to chance. Maybe he thinks that like there's more power in the metaphor by saying God, even though he knows that his view of God is not the classical one, right? So it's interesting that he did that. I saw Marsha wanting to get in again, and then maybe someone else.
Alan.
Alan.
Yeah.
So, first a comment on Einstein. He was upset by quantum physics and the probability issues around quantum physics, and that's why he made the statement. You know, the Schrodinger's cat and the electron that can be inside a box and outside the box at the same time on a probability basis. But my issue with the word God is I can't make any definition of God. And that's me. I can't, people all the time assign various attributes to God. I can't do that. So this is where I have a belief that God exists, and I'm willing to say that God is a Gödelian statement, something that is true but cannot be proven to be true. But I can't, because of that, I can't assign any attributes to God. But I know what my faith is, that God requires something of us, and hopefully, I guess maybe this is part of faith too, that we'll get something in return from that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, nice. Thank you. Marsha, was there something else you wanted to chime in on? Or
All right.
Okay.
go ahead. We can hear you now.
Yeah, okay, thank you. What I think is that people have had the need to believe in something like that, of God, because it serves their needs as people, as human beings, rather than, I can't really conceive of the concept of God itself except as a need that people have for its existence. That's how I see it, because I can't get my head around the whole idea of God itself existing. It's not something that resonates in my head. I'm too scientifically and trying to be objectively aware of the way the world is to think about some power beyond that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's a need that people have for it that I can't quite, doesn't resonate with me.
Right. Yeah, and I think that what both you and Alan are raising touches on this issue of, well, what does the word God even mean? That if we don't have a definition of something, it's hard to know what we're even talking about. So some of these issues point to a question of our use of the word God becomes very either laden with a lot of negative associations, or casually used to the point of lacking in significance, or there's a lack of clarity about what we're even talking about.
That's right.
Right.
The lack of clarity of what we're really talking about.
Right. Right. And so obviously, the role of theologians and religious philosophers is very often to clarify what it is that we mean when we're talking about God, right? And I think there are different ways to go here. And I just want to check in the chat. Yes, okay. Roberta points out that, people struggle with the concept of God, yet are in shul every week. I hope to suggest that Buber might be a very helpful way for us to think about that question. Though Buber himself was not much of a shul Jew, I think that Buber's insights are going to be very helpful. And someone else commented, Anita, that I don't believe, but I feel as a Jew that I should, right? So there's that sense, and it's interesting to say as a Jew, maybe Anita can say a little bit more about that. Where is Anita? Would Anita say a little bit more about why as a Jew you feel that you should?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So, because that's the basis of our faith, a belief in God. And my father and my grandfather believed. My mother went along with it for social reasons. And I don't know where I am.
Right. Well, I mean, I think there's certainly lots of people in the position of feeling really connected Jewishly and connected to Jewish life and finding something meaningful and valuable in a connection to the tradition and not just a kind of, and recognizing that there's something beyond just a kind of secular attachment to Jewish peoplehood. Again, I think Buber will be a kind of helpful starting point for thinking about how we might kind of go along in this way. The clarification that Buber tries to offer to some of these questions about the meaning of God, I would say goes much more in a kind of existential direction than in a cognitive direction. So we'll see that, right? Or I'll say something more about. I think I'll just let Buber speak for himself and try to let his words flow over us and give us a sense of what he's trying to communicate. But I think what one of the things that he says, and I think that we can think about this as in ways that we understand the modern world, is that one of the things he's pointing to is the fact that the myriad of ways in which it's become difficult to believe in God in the modern world. And we typically think about things like the development of modern sciences and philosophy, but also modern social and political arrangements that emphasize autonomy and democracy, all for the good, I should say, right? I think Buber doesn't want us to give up the idea of individuals being able to think for themselves, or the value of scientific developments insofar as they help humanity and help us understand the world. He's not asking that we give up those kinds of things, but he is pointing to the ways in which they have made religious faith more difficult and perhaps have obscured religious faith, in addition to other factors, which we'll get to. And he calls this the eclipse of God. So I first want to look at, going to our text now, I want to look at this first text that Buber collected a series of essays on religion and philosophy called under the title, The Eclipse of God. He doesn't actually use the phrase quite frequently in the book, but he has a conclusion in which he uses the metaphor, and he says, this is the first text here. What is it that we mean when we speak of an eclipse of God, which is even now taking place? Through this metaphor, we make the tremendous assumption that we can glance up to God with our mind's eye, or rather being's eye, as with our bodily eye to the sun, and that something can step between our existence and his and God's, as between the earth and the sun. Okay? So in using this metaphor of eclipse here, Buber is suggesting that on the one hand, we have this idea, we have this notion call it a kind of an intuition, maybe, that there is a God, that there is something beyond us that we want to use the word God to name. But at the same time, we have this sense that something is getting in the way, right? That something has gotten in the way of that connection between us and God, right? So to experience an eclipse, right? If I just told you you were in darkness, right? You wouldn't think of or I should say, I wouldn't describe darkness the same way I would describe an eclipse, right? If I say you're in the darkness, you're just in the darkness. But if you're experiencing an eclipse, you know that something has been eclipsed. You know about the possibility of the light coming from the sun, but you know that it's been obscured at this moment. And there's some hope, extending the metaphor of eclipse, right? There's a hope that the eclipse will end, right? That the thing that's obscuring the connection between God and our reality will be overcome and passed by, right? For a moment, I just want to look at this passage from the book of Deuteronomy that I think Buber is to some extent drawing on, right? And here it says, this is a passage from Deuteronomy where God is speaking to Moses. This is towards the end of the book, and is talking about how there'll be a time when the people will stray from God and God will punish them, right? And it says, I will keep my countenance hidden on that day because of all the evil they do in turning to other gods. In looking at this, I just want to put the question to you is, do you think of Buber as saying something very similar to what's in this passage in Deuteronomy, or is he saying something different than this passage of Deuteronomy, or is it a little bit of both, do you think? Or and where is the similarity and where's the difference?
But when I look at that first paragraph, the thing that comes to me is almost like the interfering thoughts, when it's, that there's something in between, our belief in the existence and God is all the interfering thoughts that come and kind of distract you from that belief. That was my first reaction to that is, it would be easy, except that this comes in and says, I don't necessarily know, I believe it. This comes in and stuff like that. So if we were going to move that to what he's saying here is that the interfering thoughts here would be as people like don't hold on to the belief and like turn to other gods or looking for something, because these gods are in small g's rather than in large G. So I'm thinking it's more other idols and stuff, something that's a little bit more proven.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I'd like to say something. I've read Buber, and I know the concept of I and thou, and it's very central to him. And that, I think, is how he's talking about God in terms of a relational thing.
Right.
And I think that concept is something that he extends to all relationships, not just God.
Yeah, that's certainly true. And yeah, I mean, I think we'll come to that in a little bit, that his understanding of God is personal, right? Interpersonal, I should say.
It's interpersonal.
Right. Yeah. So, and I think that so the Deuteronomy texts is certainly what I would call a judgmental text, right? In other words, God is saying, you have let other things get in the way, right? You have put up a boundary between me and you, because you are looking at these idols. You are looking to these idols to find meaning, these things that are not really meaningful, right? That's really the biblical conception of idolatry, certainly in the book of Deuteronomy, is that idolatry it's not just other gods, it's gods that are completely false. They have no status as divine. And so the fault really lies with us. I think Buber is Buber doesn't want to be quite as judgmental in his language, and certainly not as harsh in his language, right? But I do think that at the same time, he is pointing to the fact that we have the capacity to overcome this boundary, right? That it's something that we can deal with that obscured within us. But I would say that he's also very sympathetic to modern human beings, right? In other words, he understands that modern human beings have there's been this process of growth and development within modern humanity, away from the past that may have, in societies of the past, it may have been much easier to just speak freely in these personal metaphors about God, and we've sort of lost that ability to spontaneously speak about the world in a kind of mythological or metaphorical sort of way that allows us to speak freely about God, right? Max Weber, the great German sociologist, called this a sense of disenchantment with the world, right? That the world has lost a sense of enchantment. Right? And Buber, in a sense, you could see is trying to provide us with the language again, to remind us what that language is like, right? As a scholar of religion, as a scholar of Judaism, to remind us what that language is like in order to be able to open us up to this way of relating to God, but also relating to other people. And I'm glad that you brought up Buber's I Thou, because in a sense that
right.
It really is about connecting ultimately to other people, right? But I can only promise so much in one session. So we can bring it in, and I'll mention something about that. But going back to talking about sort of God here, was there any other comments just on the difference between Buber's passage here on the eclipse of God and Deuteronomy 31? Any other reflections or reactions there?
It seems to me that, here what hides God from the people is other gods, but it could be an event that, I'm thinking of the Holocaust, how many people lost their faith after the Holocaust.
Right.
It was something so huge that you just no longer can see God in the world.
Right. Yeah, and I think that this is why the Holocaust has been such an important point of departure for radically different approaches to Jewish theology, that I think kind of try to acknowledge that it's impossible to really say that or this way, it's difficult to say that we did something that made it difficult to believe in God, right? And I don't even mean that blaming the victim vis-a-vis the Holocaust itself, but just that for people to walk away from the Holocaust with a challenge of faith or a lack of faith, right, it's difficult to say that, well, that's because of something that's interfering with their own faith, right? That they've done something, as it were. And I by the way, I think that's even very different than, for example, the Book of Lamentations, Echa, that we read on Tisha B'Av, right? The theology of Tisha B'Av does point to the sins of the people that made them stray from God, and I think that there's a kind of a tension here. I think Buber himself, Buber began to develop these themes before the Holocaust. I think he was thinking much. He comes of age in the sort of generation or two before the Holocaust, and I think he really thinks in terms of the problem of modern society, right? He thinks in terms of the problem of social disintegration and alienation, the rise of authoritarianism in the 1920s and 30s, and he's very worried about these kinds of problems. And he looks to metaphors and images of false worship of God to kind of understand these phenomena in a religious way. I'm not sure that he necessarily completely develops a language about Auschwitz. He does write about Auschwitz in the 1940s and 50s a bit, but I'm not sure that he necessarily internalizes the significance of the Holocaust in the way that other Jewish thinkers did later on, because they sort of came of age at a different time when the Holocaust was kind of more central to Jewish thought.
There's something else too. There's the issue of the development of science and the science effect on people, particularly Jews, who got involved in research, in discovery, in analyzing things. I think of Freud, for instance, thinking about the nature of people and the concept of your brain and your anatomy and what and your life experiences shaping how you think about things like that, and the concept of God or something like that, because science changes your sense of the world, and it also would change something else like that, like your belief system.
Right. Yeah, and Buber is thinking of that kind of problem too. And it's interesting you mentioned Freud, right? Because Freud is of course a medical doctor, and he's a scientist of sorts, but he's also very influential in the social sciences, right? And there are other, and I think in the development of social science and history in the 19th century and the early 20th century is also a major factor in the way that people start to look at religion not as something that comes from God, but as something that human beings create. What's interesting about Buber is that Buber is kind of internalizing that idea. He's acknowledging that religion is something that human beings create, but he thinks that human beings create religion out of a genuine longing for God, and that longing, that there is a reality to something called God that's present in the world. That is, it's a, in the way in which, art is a response to something in the world, right? A painting or a sculpture is not an exact mimicking of the reality outside of it, right? I think he's saying that that religion is a little bit more like art in certain ways, right? It's more complicated than that, I think, for Buber. But in a sense that if you let your thinking about the world, if we let our thinking about the world be limited by simply what actually is in the most straightforward, narrow sort of way, that it actually narrows our human capacities. It narrows our full experience of humanity. And I think he thinks that religion, or at least I'll say faith in God, is a way of experiencing the fullness of humanity, right? Even as thinkers like Freud thought that religion was responsible for repressing our humanity, right? So he's really taking the opposite view of Freud in that respect.
Yeah, well, that's always been a question. I'm a psychologist by training, so that's why I brought up Freud. But
excellent.
I'm retired, but I this kind of thinking is a part of this whole conflict that exists over this issue.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to move on to the next passage, which also comes from this book, The Eclipse of God. And this really speaks more to this issue of the word God and the burdens of the word God, right? This whole question of, well, what do we mean when we talk about? And here Buber, this is from a report from a short essay of Buber's from this book, at the beginning of this book, Eclipse of God, where he records a conversation between him and a philosopher who is an atheist. And the philosopher challenges Buber and says, how can you use this word God, especially when it's been used for the sake of so much evil and injustice in history, right? And Buber's response is to acknowledge the fact that the word God has been used for evil and injustice in human history. And this is part of his response, right? He says, God is the most heavy laden of human words. None has become so soiled, so mutilated. Just for this reason, I may not abandon it. Generations of men have laid the burden of their anxious lives upon this word and weighed it to the ground. It lies in the dust and bears their whole burden. The races of men with their religious factions, have torn the word to pieces. They have killed for it and died for it, and it bears their finger marks and their blood. Where might I find a word like it to describe the highest? We may not give it up. We may not give the word God up. How understandable it is that some suggest we should remain silent about the last things for a time, in order that misused words may be redeemed. But they are not to be redeemed thus. We cannot cleanse the word God, and we cannot make it whole. But defiled and mutilated as it is, we can raise it from the ground and set it over an hour of great care. So I take it that what Buber's arguing here is that, you know, there's this association of God with all of this evil and injustice. But what he finds in that history is a longing for something higher than the self, or higher than just the community, or just human society, I should say. That is something that is genuinely transcendent and genuinely sacred. And it's that longing for something that's genuinely sacred and genuinely transcendent that he finds as the sort of the deeper meaning of the word God. It's not a precise meaning, right? Because doesn't tell us exactly, it doesn't give us the answers to the questions, right? I think in a sense, what he means is that the word God is itself a word that does not have a fixed meaning, that it's a word that is a kind of a signaling of a search for something. And because the search has not only failed so many times, but also been invoked for evil and injustice so many times, for him is only proof of the power of the word that he doesn't want to give up. And he doesn't want to deny the evil and injustice done in the name of God in human history. But for him, it remains, it's precisely that it's because it's been done in the name of evil, that it carries with it this power that if we could redeem it, he says, right? Then we could perhaps use it in a way that was really conducive towards justice and bettering humanity, right? And creating what he calls true community, right? That relationship between human beings that was mentioned before, right? His I thou, his idea of I and thou. And notice he says we can't cleanse the word God, right? I think what he means there is you can't eliminate the problematic history of the term God. And you can't make it whole, right? In other words, it's always going to be burdened with this, right? You can think of Jacob walking away limping, right, from his encounter with the angel, right? Jacob's always limping, right? He's never whole. He's not, you know, he's always has that burden with him, and as will the word God. But he says we can raise it from the ground and set it over at an hour of great care. That and I think that you know what he's after here is, you know, can we begin to use it again to talk about religion, to talk about something sacred in a way that will really speak to us, right? Any thoughts or reactions there, or any questions? So now we get to the question of faith.
I have a question, actually.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, what can raise it from the ground and set it over an hour of great care mean?
I'm wondering whether I made a mistake in the transmission here, so I'm going to look up the text, but yeah, no, that's actually what the text says, but I think what he means is an hour of great care as kind of a moment of great significance, right? That if we can speak of God as being present in moments of significance, then perhaps we can raise it from the ground and be able to use it again to speak to the significance of life. I actually think that going to the next section will begin to, the next two sections will give us some, maybe give us a little bit more insight into what he's trying to say, because he'll say more explicitly the way he thinks about faith and the way he thinks about God. So don't let me sort of lose the point, you know, if I haven't clarified that even more in the next, you know, 10 to 15 minutes or so, come back and ask me, because I think the next two paragraphs will sort of give us a little bit more clarity about that, right? And here we're going to get to what I was saying before, right? I think it was Roberta who talked about faith versus belief, right? So right off the bat, what Buber is going to say in this next section is that faith is not a matter of belief in a fact or belief in some nature of something, right? He says it's not a truth of a ready-made formula, right? So I'm going to read the first two sentences and then I'm going to pause, right? Real faith does not mean professing what we hold true in a ready-made formula. On the contrary, it means holding ourselves open to the unconditional mystery which we encounter in every sphere of our life and which cannot be comprised in any formula, right? So I'm going to hold off a second on what he means by unconditional mystery, right? But notice that what he's saying is that belief in God is not a matter of dogma. It's not a matter of, or faith.
We can't hear you.
Can't hear me.
I can hear you.
Can other people hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Naomi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay. So faith doesn't mean formula, right? That was what we were talking before, like Roberta's distinction between belief and faith, right? So Buber's basically saying that that kind of cognitive belief is not really what we're doing when we're talking about God, when we're talking about faith in God, right? We may have cognitive beliefs about a variety of things, but he's basically saying that cognitive beliefs are not really appropriate for God. That they don't really help us understand God. They don't help us relate to God. So if we're going to use the word God, we shouldn't be thinking in terms of cognitive beliefs, right? We should be thinking about something else. Let's unpack now what he means then, right? So I'm going to go back to the second sentence and I'll read onwards. So on the contrary, right? On the contrary, it means holding ourselves open to the unconditional mystery which we encounter in every sphere of our life and which cannot be comprised in any formula. It means that from the very roots of our being, we should always be prepared to live with this mystery. The forms in which the mystery approaches us are nothing but our personal experiences. At times, it is very difficult to live with the mystery and to be constant to it in the midst of these ever new, unforeseen, surprising, precipitating, and overpowering experiences. But there is something which can help us, and there are helpers. There is the living transmission of those who have really lived with the mystery, and above all, those who are of our kind, who had our tidings. They help us through the pure strength with which they experienced the mystery, faced it, and engaged their lives to it. For to believe means to engage oneself. Okay, what is Buber trying to say? Let me just start with with a question to you, which is, what do you make of this term mystery, right? As a way, clearly he's associating God with the mystery, right? So I'm not saying that he's defining God as a mystery, but that's how that's essentially the word mystery here is kind of his placeholder for the word God at this point, right? So
right.
How does that feel? Like, I guess I'm sort of saying, like, theologically, try that on for size. How does that seem to you? Is it helpful to think about God as a mystery, or does that feel difficult or problematic?
So,
Something else.
can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead, Anita, yeah.
Okay, so if God is a mystery and it's hard to live with mystery on a regular basis. I mean, we're living through a mystery now of the COVID-19, and it's hard to live with that and to be present to the mystery. We try most of the time not to live in mystery, to have fixed things that speak to us, and that's it.
Yeah, yeah.
There's also something else here that strikes me, at least. It has to do with science and with knowledge and the relational thing to the modern world and to the concept in science is discovery, and discovery has to do with enlightenment and learning something new, that you find out a new fact or a new problem, and you try to solve the problem and you think about it. So you have a relational thing to the problem that you're handling and to the situation that you're dealing with. And it stops being a mystery. It's something to be solved. The mystery is something to be solved. It's
Right.
not something to just live with. And that changes the nature of the relation of religion itself.
Right.
It changes the whole concept.
Right. So I think that I want to kind of bring together these 2 points really quick, and I'm glad Ellen chimed in on the chat, and everyone's welcome to do that, saying, so Ellen said that thinking of God as a mystery is the only way I could conceive of God. Ellen, actually, before I comment, Ellen, do you want to say more about why that is?
Hi, I just unmuted myself.
Sure.
It's basically based on my feeling of the world. It's entirely emotional, and I can't explain it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, so then in responding to the last the prior 2 comments, right? So I think Buber is concerned that the scientific pursuit of the dispelling of mysteries, right? Which, again, it's not that Buber is saying that science is wrong or wrong-headed in and of itself, right? I think what he's worried about is the reduction of all human activity in the realm of knowledge to the dispelling of mysteries. But I think he thinks that there's something about life that is irreducibly mysterious, and that mystery is particularly present to us in times of oppression and suffering. And that when we experience, when we experience disorderliness in the world, when we experience, a kind of unraveling in our lives, whether at a social level or at an individual level, or whether it's something as overwhelming as the Holocaust, that our inability to kind of accept mysteriousness in life limits our ability to really make it through the challenges of suffering that are posed to us. Now, I think the question is whether we might ask Buber is whether his response theologically is sufficient, right? Because I know one theologian in particular, Rabbi Bradley Shavat-Artson. Some of you may have come across his work or heard him speak. He's very concerned with the use of this term mystery because it leaves a sense that God might bring suffering upon people without, and we say, well, we don't know why, it's a mystery, right? I'm not sure that that's what Buber is trying to get, but I want to acknowledge that might be a challenging term, right? James mentions in the chat that that the Catholics refer to the resurrection of Christ as the mystery of faith, right? So there may be certain, key elements of theology and other traditions as well that are referred to as a mystery. right? I think and Anita was had mentioned, what sort of what's going on now, right? That this living through this very challenging time, challenging kind of at a social level, obviously from the standpoint of security and feeling secure, right? People are going through various kinds of feelings of insecurity. I think what Buber is trying to say is that belief in God, or that faith, is a way to find a kind of security within that confrontation with insecurity, right? And I want to be careful here because, right, like what sometimes gets said is, right, well, if something bad's happening to you, well, God's going to, it'll be okay someday, right? I don't think that's what Buber's trying to get at, but I think what he is trying to say is that what faith allows us to do is it allows us to maintain a kind of persistence in the face of suffering, a kind of spiritual persistence in the face of suffering. And that's what he thinks faith is. And I think and by the way, I should say, one of the things that Buber says in other places, I didn't bring a citation of this here, is that sometimes people who call themselves atheists, people who don't want to use the word God, exhibit genuine faith. Okay, so if we take what Buber said above about acknowledging that the word God is so heavily burdened and so heavily laden with a bad history, right? Is at the same time he acknowledges that people who don't use the word God, or people who call themselves atheists, may actually demonstrate what he thinks of as true faith, because they maintain that kind of spiritual persistence in the face of evil and suffering, right?
So I'm interested in his the idea here of the helpers, because it seems to me that when you're about to lose faith, or because of all these things that are happening, and some of it is in the paragraph that's above, but on here are the overpowering experiences. But then there's something that could help us, and there are helpers. And it's, my first reaction was, that's the rabbi of a synagogue who will bring faith back to you because they believe it more than the person who's experiencing all these problems right now. So it's almost like you need the community to kind of believe in this. You need more than one person to believe in this faith.
Yeah, I think that's great, and I'm glad you focus on that, right? Who are the helpers here? I think that I think that's a great point, right? Who are the helpers, right? So again, for Buber, going through a difficult time is not something we do alone, right? And the idea of going through a difficult time and trying to find faith, again, trying to find faith in difficult times is not something that's easily done, and it's going to be done with other people. And so notice that what he says here, how does he characterize the helpers, right? There is the living transmission of those who have really lived with the mystery. So that's one part of who the helpers are. And I read that to mean essentially voices from the past, right? Buber is a scholar of Hasidism and a scholar of the Hebrew Bible, in particular the prophets. And I think what he's writing, when he writes about the Hasidic teachers, right, the Rebbes and the great Hasidic teachers, and when he writes about the prophets, what he thinks about them is what makes them such great writers and such great teachers is their capacity to address what it is to live through difficult times and live in a faithful way through suffering and through oppression and through evil, right? So I took initially him to be saying, so it's interesting that, Roberta, you were thinking of the rabbi of the synagogue, right? Yes, the rabbi of the synagogue, and in part I would say because, or any of our teachers really, in part because they're reading from this tradition. But for Buber, what makes the tradition beautiful, it's not just that the rabbis were very holy people and, it's that they lived through moments of suffering, evil, and oppression and maintained this kind of spiritual persistence along the way, right?
But
Now,
people have, sorry,
So give me just a second, right? And let me just, so then if you look at the second half of that sentence, and above all, those who are of our kind, who had our tidings, right? So I think there, Buber's pointing to other people, maybe in the past, maybe voices from the past, or maybe people around us who've gone through something like what we've gone through. Now, obviously, it's you can't compare suffering, right? No one's suffering is exactly the same. But when people have been through that, it's possible, I think, to make a connection that you feel heard and understood through that. And that allows us to, I think what we were saying is, allows us to maintain this kind of spiritual persistence in times of suffering and evil, right?
I think that's very true. I mean, I think when someone goes through a loss and they feel so alone, and someone comes and says, I've had the same loss, and yet they're an example of someone who still believes or still connects. I think that that's very much an example, of that kind of thing.
Yeah.
I think that there's an issue of relatedness. It's a relational thing.
Yes. And that's for Buber, I didn't bring a text about Buber's idea of I and now, but I would say that for Buber, I'm going to put it in a different way, is if you've heard of the concept of imitation of God, right? The Latin phrase imitatio Dei is often used, but or the phrase from the book of Deuteronomy that's cited in many places is walking in God's ways. What does it mean to walk in God's ways? And I think Buber's interpretation of that tradition in rabbinic Judaism is that to walk in God's way is to be there for other people, right? Being there for other people in times of suffering is the way in which we imitate God. And maybe I should have brought a text where he talks about that too. But I think that's really central to his way of understanding this relational dimension, right? And that's who the helpers are, right? So the helpers can be voices from the tradition. They can be contemporary teachers who bring us the voice of the tradition, and they can be people who, have an understanding of what we're going through because they've gone through something similar as well.
We talked about the concept of I and thou. If that's not relational, I don't know what is.
That's right. No, it's really central to his thought. Anita, yeah, you were.
We're going to have a day of Tisha B'Av, and the prophets saw the destruction of the temple, the destruction of the two temples as a terrible thing to live through. And they lived through it, and they lived through it with giving hope to their communities. So, of course, it was less existential because we had done something wrong as a people, but it was a suffering that they lived through. And we tend to, so many years later, we are not aware of what it was that they lived through. Right. But to them, the destruction of the temples were like to us, the Holocaust, maybe.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that's very helpful, and that's right. I mean, I think what's interesting is I think what Buber tries to do in general is he tries to move away from a very explicit theology of punishment.
That's right.
He moves towards more of a theology of crisis. And so for Buber, the question isn't so much why did it happen? The question is, what do we do now? And how do we respond? And I think that it shifts the burden away from, well, do I have to say that I did something that we, it's not so much about, well, what sin did we commit for this to happen, right? That's one way of finding meaning. I think Buber is saying there's nothing inherently wrong with that, but I think he's saying that's not the only way that we can find meaning in response to suffering. There's another way, what I'm calling spiritual, what I'm calling spiritual persistence, right, is this maintaining of hope in the face of suffering, right? And I think that's perhaps a little bit more a little bit more in keeping with our modern sensibilities, right? That we don't necessarily believe that if we've experienced some tragedy or some suffering, that it's a result of our sins. But nonetheless, right, Buber does see there being a responsibility, and we're going to actually get to that in a moment, that there's a responsibility placed on us even in a moment of suffering. And I want to be clear, though, that I don't think what he means by that is, you know, if we're the victim, we have to do something about it. To, you know, it's not the kind of theological analog of lifting yourself up by your bootstraps or something like that, right? It's saying that even moments, right, and I think this is the point, is that even moments where we face suffering and evil, that there's the possibility of an encounter with the divine. And I think he actually thinks that it's especially in the moments of suffering and evil and oppression that we have the possibility of experiencing the divine. So while it may seem, right, that suffering and oppression would be moments where the divine is furthest away from us, that he wants us to, he's essentially inviting us to see these kinds of moments as moments where the divine is actually potentially closest to us, but we have to be open to it and we have to see it, okay? There's another passage in Buber where he talks, for example, about Hagar, right? Who sees God at the well, but initially she doesn't, right? She's out there in the wilderness, she's with her baby, and she doesn't, or maybe this is when she's pregnant, right? And she believes she's being sent off in the wilderness pregnant to die, and she doesn't, you know, she doesn't recognize, initially she doesn't recognize the presence of the angel that's there to help her, but she does eventually recognize it. And I think that's what Buber's idea is, right? That, you know, it's not that Hagar did anything wrong. It's not that Hagar is somehow responsible for what's happened to her. Quite the contrary, right? She's very much the victim. But in that moment, if she doesn't open up her eyes, if she doesn't have that moment where she's open to the possibility of some hope, then she'll miss the vision, right? With that, I want to move on to the last section because I think it'll help us sort of bring everything together, and I'm conscious of the time. Okay, so this is now about images of God. And here we get back to Buber's use of images, or Buber's use of the metaphor of idolatry, right? So he says that time after time, the images of God must be broken. The iconoclasts must have their way. For the iconoclast is the soul of man which rebels against having an image that can no longer be believed in, elevated above the heads of man as a thing that demands to be worshipped. In their longing for a God, men try again and again to set up a greater, a more genuine, and a more just image, which is intended to be more glorious than the last and only proves more unsatisfactory. The images topple, but the voice is never silenced. And this is Deuteronomy. You heard the voice of words, but you saw no form. This is from Deuteronomy 4, where God is, this is a recounting of the giving of the 10 Commandments. The voice speaks in the guise of everything that happens, in the guise of all world events. It speaks to the men of all generations, makes demands upon them, and summons them to accept their responsibility. I have pointed out that it is of utmost importance not to lose one's openness, but to be open means not to shut out the voice. Call it what you will. It does not matter what you call it. All that matters is that you hear it. Okay. So let's connect this, what Buber's saying here, to what he said above about God being a burdened word, right? God, in a sense, for Buber, is also a placeholder for different images of God, different ways of talking about God. And what's important for him is that it doesn't matter whether you use the word God or not, and it matters what images you use, but he means that in the sense that the images of God that you use have to be images that you actually connect with, that are actually powerful for you in terms of the authentic experience of your life. if the image of God that's put in front of you by the religion that you're a part of, by the teachers that you have, if those images of God are, to use his language, elevated above your head as a thing that demands to be worshiped, then that's not a source of meaning. That's not connecting you to the mystery of life, right? That's not going to help create that kind of spiritual persistence in the face of suffering and evil, right? And that's why he praises this kind of iconoclasm within the human, sort of within the human condition, that we go through these phases as human societies where we look at the images of God that we have, we rebel against them, we try to create new ones, but they also end up being unsatisfactory in a way, right? And so we have to sort of keep on moving, right? And so part of spiritual persistence is persisting in trying to find new ways of talking about God and not letting the word God become a kind of cage in which we're sort of trapped in only one way of thinking about God. And I think that's what he sees as sort of in the process of Midrash also, right? Buber's grandfather was a great scholar of Midrash, actually, right? So he had a lot of differences with his grandfather, but was also very fond and indebted to his grandfather. His grandfather taught him a great deal. And I think that that's what Buber finds in the process of Midrash, are these new ways of thinking and talking about God, and in particularly understanding Kabbalah and then Hasidic interpretations of Kabbalah as a kind of midrashic process of understanding God in new ways, right? You think of that famous Hasidic story, right, where the rabbi says, God, he's talking to a child who plays hide and seek, and the rabbi says, I know what that's like when I feel like that that God is hiding and I'm trying to seek him, but I can't, but I never find him. Or that people never got, or God, I think it's a God feels that way because God is hiding and wants us to seek God out, right? And people never do it, right? So this is a kind of a radically beautiful, different kind of image of God that he finds in Hasidism, and wants to bring us sources from Hasidism and Midrash and the Bible, to not as sources of authority for authoritative images of God, but to actually teach us about the way in which we ourselves can create new images of God in every generation that really speak to us, right? And so, to go back to this point about what it means to have faith, right? It's what he means. It's when he talks about hearing that voice, right? That for him is faith, is to be able to say, even in the face of evil and suffering and oppression, I still hear a voice and I still have a sense of responsibility. Now, the sense of responsibility that may be generated in the face of my own personal suffering, or in the face of great sort of societal evil like the Holocaust, would be very, very, or the destruction of the temples, right? Those are all going to be very different, and we can't have ready-made answers, right? So having ready-made answers for our own suffering or for somebody else's is never going to be satisfactory or appropriate, right? But being open to that, being open to having some response, right? And you think of the connection between the word response and responsibility, right? That even moments of suffering and oppression are moments of potential response, that we can respond to them. And I think that's what Buber means. That's what I mean by talking about Buber in terms of spiritual persistence. I think what Buber is really concerned about here when it comes to faith, what he's really worried about is that kind of spiritual persistence in the face of evil and suffering. What he's really worried about is human beings giving up on the world, giving up hope, and giving up on the possibility of fighting injustice, in addition to responding with caring and support to those who are suffering. And that's really the lack of faith that he's worried about. Isn't that you don't say the word God the right way, or you don't believe in the word God the right way. The kind of the kind of lack of faith he's worried about is the kind of giving up on the world, right? A lack of spirit of what I'm calling spiritual persistence. So I think, yeah, Ellen asked a question a little while ago, and I waited to respond, and maybe I've already said a little bit to respond to it. So in the chat, Ellen says, am I correct in assuming that Buber accepts evil in the world and focuses on a response to it and doesn't hold God responsible? I actually think in a sense he's, I think that in a sense he does actually think that all events in the world come from God in a way. But I don't think that I don't know that he necessarily thinks that we have to believe something like, well, you know, God wanted that thing to happen to you, right? He doesn't really ever say that, right? It's not as if God says, well, you know, I'm going to send you some terrible thing to your life because there's for some reason. And I don't think that that's what really Buber thinks. And I don't think that he wants us to think that way. But I think the key for Buber is that even in the face of moments of suffering, that the divine presence is not absent, and that these are also moments that call upon us to take responsibility for something, right? And what that responsibility looks like is going to depend on the moment. Right? And again, look for the helpers, right? Someone mentioned Mr. Rogers, right? So in a disaster, look for the helpers. And I think, you know, the Mr. Rogers illusion there is very powerful, right? Because what he's trying to say is think hopefully, right? Don't lose a sense of hope. And I think that's the same idea.
Where does Buber think, what does he think the origin of evil is?
Well, you know, Buber's sense of evil is not necessarily sort of cosmic or metaphysical. It's not a kind of, there isn't like some cosmic origin of evil. I think for Buber, what the evil that interests him in a way, if you will, is the evil that emanates from human behavior, that human beings have. It's really, Buber is really building on the view that human beings have an evil inclination and a good inclination. And that it's the evil inclination that, you know, the challenge of human life is essentially to rein in the evil inclination, right? The evil inclination is essentially the selfish inclination. And and here I think Buber is very consistent with the rabbinic tradition in this way, is that the selfish inclination, the inclination to do things for ourselves, has a very constructive role in human development. And it's really just a question of, can it be channeled in a way that's also social and just and caring towards others? You know, that can it be consistent with a life of justice and caring for others? Insofar as there's sort of, I would say maybe Buber, we might contrast between evil and misfortune, right? That there's evil that comes from within humanity, and there's misfortune in the world, right? That we suffer from disease, that we face natural disasters, that these kinds of misfortunes, I don't think he's, you know, it's possible to say, well, that they come from God, but I don't think that he's particularly concerned to attribute those to God. But he certainly doesn't attribute them to some sort of other demonic force. He's really against that way of thinking. And I think what he would say is the question again is not so much how do you explain why we suffer from a natural disaster or from a disease. The question is not how do we explain it. The question is how do we respond. And we can think about that in terms of faith also, right? In other words, his view of faith is not that faith is belief or dogma. His view of faith is that it's about trust and relationship and dialogue. So again, the response to suffering isn't so much about, well, why did it happen? It's really about what do we do now, right? And again, and with this I can sort of bring it to a close. I'd be happy to sort of entertain some additional questions or discussion, but the real concern of Buber's is that we not give up on life, right? That we not give up on the world, that in the face of evil, oppression, and suffering, that we not give up on the possibilities of life, the possibility for meaning in life, the possibility of creating a more just society, the possibility of having meaningful relationships with people who care for us and love us, and that we share in those relationships, right? So all forms of suffering and despair and evil that we face, Buber's conception of faith is really to find a way to respond in a way that allows us to persist in that hope for meaning, for justice, for community, for caring, for love. And you know, all of this talk of mystery, right? I think that you know, when he says to be prepared to live with this mystery, right? That there is an uncertainty, but it's also for Buber, it's an uncertainty that is a dynamic uncertainty. It's an uncertainty of openness to possibility, right? So that's, I think he's saying is, maybe it's easier to live with openness to new possibility and to be open to the world when we're not suffering, right? When things are good. The real challenge is when we experience suffering, is to have that kind of openness. Any other questions or
one thing that,
yeah, please go ahead. Go ahead.
One thing that I was going to say is that the whole relational thing, the I-thou idea, is that you're relating to what you're coping with the world itself, with your relationships with others, your relationships with the things you do in relation to other people. And this is what he's really talking about in terms of I and thou. It isn't just the relation to someone else, but also to the what you're coping with.
Right. Yeah. And I would say that, yeah, I mean, giving up, when I say that, you know, faith is sort of a matter of not giving up on the world, it's also not giving up on people, right? Not giving up on relationships.
That's right. And also to relating to the problems and situations that you're coping with, and to the people who are involved in those situations.
Right. Yeah. Very helpful. Thank you.
Can I say something?
Yeah, please.
I want to thank you very much for your openness in bringing this discussion. It's been very meaningful to me.
Great, thank you. I appreciate it. And thank you for all, you know, helping me learn. So I really feel like I learn a lot in teaching and in hearing from your voices. So really fantastic. It's great being with you all. I'll open it up to another comment or question.
Just wanted to thank you for doing this.
Thank you.
Me too. Wonderful class.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I wish you a meaningful commemoration of Tisha B'Av, and I know this is a difficult time for us. I hope we are able to persist in our affirmation of life and faith as a kind of spiritual persistence. I look forward to seeing you in person, whether at Anshe Chesed or just maybe on the streets of the Upper West Side. And I hope we're all healthy and safe. Thank you very much. Take care.